The world has spent nearly 3 decades watching a very specific drama unfold around the enduring ghost of Princess Diana. Yet the most profound development in recent memory did not happen in front of a flashing camera or through a primetime television broadcast. It happened in absolute silence behind the heavy, guarded gates of Althorpe Estate. Charles Spencer, a man who has deliberately avoided the public eye and media circus surrounding his sister's legacy for almost 30 years, recently received a massive, highly ambitious, and lucrative proposal from the Sussex camp. This was not merely an invitation to collaborate on a standard documentary project or a routine historical review. It was an intricate, carefully orchestrated pitch that aimed to secure unprecedented access to the most private and sacred archives of Diana's life. When faced with this heavily backed proposal, Charles Spencer did not issue a public statement, nor did he sit down for an exclusive interview to air his grievances. Instead, he simply and unequivocally said no. That single, flat refusal landed within the global royal landscape with the force of a thunderclap, instantly sending shockwaves through the inner circles of royal commentators, media executives, and public observers alike. To truly understand why a single word spoken behind closed doors carries such earth-shattering weight, one must first look back at the historical foundation of Charles Spencer's self-appointed role as the ultimate guardian of his sister's memory. Most people across the globe remember September 6, 1997, at Westminster Abbey, where a global television audience of roughly 2 billion people watched a young man stand at a lectern in a dark suit. His voice was tightly controlled, but his eyes carried something raw, unfiltered, and entirely untamed by protocol or convention. When he spoke of his sister as a genuinely British girl, highlighting her laughter, her naturalness, and the authentic quality of her profound compassion, every single person in that historic building stood completely still. Then came the promise that would echo through the stone naves and out into the streets, capturing the attention and fierce loyalty of millions. He promised that Diana's young sons would be shielded from the cold, dysfunctional machinery that had ruthlessly chewed their mother apart. He vowed with absolute conviction that her blood family, the Spencers, would never permit the rigid royal institution to swallow them whole the way it had consumed her. He delivered those words directly from the lectern, looking unflinchingly into the faces of the Queen, Prince Philip, and the future king sitting just a few feet away. Having made that sacred vow before the entire world, he walked away from the glaring spotlight, retreated to the peaceful grounds of Althorpe, and for the most part completely disappeared from public view. That long, deliberate, almost eerie invisibility is precisely what grants his recent actions such staggering significance in modern media culture. We live in a society completely saturated by Diana's reproduced image, where her face perpetually graces magazine covers, commemorative stamps, streaming thumbnails, and memorial merchandise, making her one of the most commercially exploited figures in celebrity history. Through every wave of commercialization, Charles Spencer has steadfastly refused to open the vault, refused to sell the family archives, refused to grant the interviews that would crack the door open even an inch, and refused to commercialize the estate grounds for anything beyond what he deemed strictly respectful and appropriate. For decades, the public has been left to wonder what secrets lie hidden within those private archives. Handwritten diaries, intimate home movies, and candid photographs from ordinary family days that were never meant to be displayed to a global audience. The raw, unguarded Diana, the woman who exists in no authorized biography, no commercial documentary, and no streaming series, survives today solely because one man has spent a lifetime maintaining a wall of absolute rejection against the relentless tide of commercial temptation. What makes this ironclad discipline genuinely remarkable is that the financial incentives presented to him have never been small or insignificant. By all credible accounts, the offers have been consistent, lavish, and aggressively pushed by skilled intermediaries who specialize in making profound compromises feel like acts of wisdom and historical necessity. Major book publishers, international broadcasters, and streaming giants wielding 9-figure content budgets have continuously knocked on his door, bringing teams of persuasive producers trained to convince anyone that the unthinkable is completely reasonable. The pitch is always framed around a seductive narrative. The world deserves to know her properly. You have the power to control how it is done, You can shape the narrative far better than someone who gets it wrong, and it is better for you to curate her legacy than leave it to strangers. Yet, for 30 years, Charles Spencer has met every single iteration of that persuasive argument with the exact same unyielding response. He does not need the money, he does not need the public profile, and most importantly, he firmly believes that the public's insatiable desire to consume Diana is entirely different from the public's right to consume her. That single, razor-sharp distinction is a moral line that almost no one else in the celebrity sphere has ever been willing to draw, and it forms the unbreakable foundation of everything he has done since that unforgettable day at Westminster Abbey. To fully grasp why the recent proposal from the Sussex camp caused such an explosive reaction, one must examine the slow, methodical accumulation of events that preceded it, beginning with a seemingly innocent moment during the royal wedding of May 2018. As the evening reception commenced, Meghan Markle arrived wearing Diana's iconic aquamarine ring, featuring a distinctive pale blue gemstone immediately recognizable to anyone who had followed the late princess's life story. From the perspective of anyone watching closely, it felt like a tender and deeply emotional gesture. A new family member chosen by his nephew proudly carrying Diana into the most monumental night of her life. It felt like a genuine act of remembrance, perhaps even a comforting bridge of family continuity. However, that initial appearance was soon followed by a succession of carefully curated accessories. The butterfly earrings, the classic Cartier watch, the vintage gold bracelets. Each item surfacing on Meghan at precisely the moments when photographic exposure was not merely likely, but absolutely guaranteed. Major public engagements, highly choreographed arrivals, and maximum camera lens coverage became the backdrop for these deeply symbolic heirlooms. Now, it must be stated with absolute fairness that no one can definitively prove the primary intention behind wearing these items was anything other than a genuine personal tribute. Grief is profoundly complicated, and marrying into one of the most emotionally complex families in modern history brings immense pressure, meaning that wearing a late mother-in-law's jewelry is not, on its own, concrete evidence of a cold strategy. Yet, any objective observer must pause and confront the harder question. At what point does a personal tribute transition into a recurring pattern, and when does a distinct pattern begin to look like a meticulously calculated choice? Once might easily be dismissed as a heartfelt tribute, twice as a personal habit, but every single time these items appear precisely at high-profile events designed for maximum global camera coverage, it inevitably begins to resemble something far more strategic. The man watching quietly from Althorpe was paying exceptionally close attention, cataloging every single frame because these items were never just ordinary pieces of jewelry. They were tangible, irreplaceable fragments of Diana's personal story being actively transplanted into someone else's curated narrative without a single conversation with the estate that holds the originals. This brings us directly to the seismic event of March 2021, the infamous Oprah Winfrey interview that captured the undivided attention of the entire planet. Picture that broadcast through the specific lens of how Charles Spencer reportedly experienced it. Sitting quietly inside the very house where Diana grew up, surrounded by the rooms where they ran as children. The setting was intentionally designed to look golden, intimate, and warm, featuring low lighting and soft furnishings that immediately signaled the architecture of personal confession rather than aggressive confrontation. It featured one woman speaking candidly, one deeply sympathetic interviewer, and a powerful narrative highlighting an unyielding institution that had allegedly silenced her, dismissed her deep suffering, and left her completely isolated with nowhere else to turn except directly to the public. If one knows their royal history intimately, the feeling of recognition hits instantly because the entire structure mirrors the infamous 1995 Panorama interview given by Diana herself. The structural parallels are staggering. A royal wife isolated within the rigid confines of an archaic institution, speaking of an indifferent palace apparatus deaf to her emotional pain, finding every internal door firmly locked, and ultimately deciding to bypass the traditional hierarchy to speak directly to the nation through a single trusted confidant. The lighting choices rhyme, the narrative casting rhymes, the underlying grammar of perceived victimhood rhymes, and the emotional arc follows the exact same trajectory. Yet, there is one critical, glaring difference that serves as the most telling detail in this entire historical comparison. Diana gave her groundbreaking 1995 interview while she was still genuinely trapped deep inside the working system. Facing immense isolation with no clear exit in sight and zero financial resources beyond what the institution permitted her to have, making it a true cry of desperation from inside a locked room. In stark contrast, the 2021 television special was filmed from a luxurious California villa long after their formal exit, supported by a massive production apparatus already in motion, a streaming empire actively in development, and a brand identity rapidly taking shape. The original interview was an act of raw distress born from helplessness, whereas the modern counterpart functioned fundamentally as a commercial launch. Witnessing this reenactment from his private sitting room at Althorpe, Charles Spencer did not view that televised hour as a respectful tribute, but rather as a calculated appropriation of his sister's historical trauma. To truly understand why this particular moment cut him so deeply and crossed a line that the jewelry had only approached, one must confront a painful historical reality that mainstream royal coverage often avoids. It was Charles Spencer himself who originally introduced his sister to Martin Bashir, the deceitful journalist behind the 1995 Panorama broadcast. At the time, he genuinely believed he was performing a helpful and protective act, having been shown fabricated bank statements and forged documents that falsely suggested people close to Diana were being paid to spy on her and monitor her every move. Deceived by these elaborate forgeries, he unknowingly opened the door that allowed a deeply vulnerable woman to sit in front of cameras and bear her deepest pain to a global audience that consumed it as entertainment. Decades later, a formal inquiry led by Lord Dyson, a former Supreme Court justice, exposed the shocking extent of those fabrications, confirming that fake bank statements were deliberately manufactured to convince an isolated princess that everyone around her was an enemy. The BBC's Director General eventually issued a formal, personal apology directly to Charles Spencer for the gross deception that manipulated him into arranging the fateful meeting. Think deeply about the psychological devastation that inflicts upon a person who has spent their entire adult life dedicated to protecting their sister's memory. You stand before 2 billion people in Westminster Abbey and promise to shield her sons, carrying that sacred vow as the defining purpose of your existence, only to discover years later that the most psychologically damaging media event of her life walked through a door you were tricked into opening. Every action Charles Spencer has taken since that devastating revelation has been an act of quiet, relentless atonement. The sealed family archives, the continuous yearly refusals, the deliberate decision to bury Diana on a secluded island at Althorpe rather than surrender her remains to any public institution, and the protection of home movies and handwritten diaries. He has worked tirelessly to ensure that a media circus like Panorama can never happen to Diana again, neither in life nor in death. In doing so, he achieved something almost miraculous in the modern era. He successfully protected her enduring mystery, ensuring that a genuinely unguarded, fully human, and private Diana remains untouched by the relentless demands of the modern content machine. As the narrative surrounding the Althorpe estate and the Sussex camp intensified heading deeper into the decade, the friction points multiplied far beyond rejected documentary proposals or disputed family heirlooms. To truly comprehend the gravity of Charles Spencer's silence, one must examine how the broader royal landscape was shifting beneath their feet, particularly regarding the internal dynamics of the British monarchy and the persistent shadow cast by the ghosts of the past. By the time 2026 rolled around, the public had grown increasingly fatigued by perpetual transatlantic drama, yet the appetite for untold truths regarding Diana's inner circle remained insatiable. Throughout these years, Prince William has maintained a position of quiet, stoic dignity, navigating the agonizing reality of having his mother's legacy continuously invoked, commercialized, and weaponized on the global stage. Observers close to the royal household have frequently noted that the future king has spent years privately agonizing over the relentless monetization of his mother's tragic fate, yet his institutional role severely limits his ability to respond publicly. When a reigning monarch or a direct heir to the throne steps into the fray to counter public narratives, the entire weight of the establishment machinery moves with them, inevitably transforming a personal family dispute into a massive constitutional crisis. If William were to personally step forward and openly condemn his brother's commercial projects or media ventures, the global press would immediately spin it as a calculated act of palace censorship, fueling the very narrative of a ruthless, suffocating institution that Diana fought against throughout her adult life. The genius and profound significance of Charles Spencer's intervention lie precisely in this structural reality. As an independent landowner with aristocratic lineage, blood authority, and zero institutional office to protect, he operates entirely outside the constraints of the crown. He does not represent the firm, he does not answer to parliamentary advisors, and he holds no public crown image to safeguard from controversy. When he slammed the door shut on the multi-million-dollar streaming proposal, it was not the cold, faceless machinery of Buckingham Palace defending its borders. It was a grieving brother, a maternal uncle, and the rightful custodian of the family bloodline, drawing an unbreakable boundary in the sand. Royal commentators across Britain and the United States quickly recognized this crucial distinction, pointing out that no PR team in Montecito could successfully spin or weaponize a refusal coming directly from Diana's own flesh and blood. 4 months following the quiet rejection, Hollywood and royal insiders buzzed with speculation regarding what precisely was contained within those sealed archives that made the stakes so terrifyingly high for anyone attempting to control the narrative. The mythos of Diana has always relied heavily on the duality between her public persona, the radiant global icon who graced magazine covers and championed humanitarian causes, and her deeply private, vulnerable self, who suffered behind closed doors under the immense weight of royal expectations. That private self is precisely what the Althorpe Archive preserves in amber. Unlike public transcripts, official court circulars, or authorized biographies written by external historians, the documents held within those estate walls represent unfiltered history. Handwritten diaries penned during moments of profound isolation, private home movies capturing unscripted laughter on the sweeping lawns of Northamptonshire, and personal correspondence detailing the raw, unedited emotional reality of her existence form a biographical treasure trove that modern entertainment executives view as the ultimate holy grail. In an era where streaming platforms constantly fight for subscriber retention through sensationalized true crime documentaries and dramatic royal exposés, acquiring access to Diana's untouched personal vault would represent the ultimate commercial coup. Yet, the very qualities that make these documents priceless to Hollywood, their raw intimacy, their emotional vulnerability, and their potential to rewrite or reshape public perception, are the exact reasons why Charles Spencer guards them with such ferocious dedication. To him, handing over those diaries and home movies to a commercial production company driven by quarterly subscriber targets and global marketing campaigns would be an ultimate betrayal of the vow he made at Westminster Abbey. It would mean taking the most sacred, private fragments of his sister's shattered life and throwing them into the roaring furnace of the modern attention economy. The refusal was therefore much more than a simple business disagreement between an estate owner and a media production house. It was a moral stand against the relentless commodification of human grief, a declaration that some things in this world remain infinitely more valuable than a 9-figure streaming contract. This philosophical divide highlights a deeper, more uncomfortable truth about how modern celebrity culture interacts with historical trauma. We live in a digital ecosystem that treats human suffering as a renewable resource, where personal tragedies are swiftly converted into binge-watchable content, viral social media threads, and profitable brand extensions. When Harry and Meghan relocated to California and established their multimedia production ventures, they quickly discovered a harsh economic reality. While high-minded philanthropic initiatives and lifestyle brands generate pleasant headlines, the true currency of the modern attention market is royal proximity and emotional conflict. Every single project that strayed too far from the orbit of the British monarchy or the shadow of Princess Diana struggled to capture public imagination, while anything touching upon royal wounds, institutional betrayals, and family fractures instantly dominated global news cycles. This economic trap created a desperate need to continually mine the past, pushing producers to seek out bigger, more foundational pieces of the Diana mythology to keep their commercial engines running. By the time the grand 2027 anniversary documentary proposal was drafted, complete with its ambitious concept of ceremoniously transferring Diana's halo onto a new head and filming on the sacred, restricted grounds of Althorp. The operation had reached a critical juncture where securing the archive was no longer just a creative preference, but an absolute operational necessity. The sheer audacity of asking for access to the private island where Diana is laid to rest, a location specifically chosen by her family to be entirely beyond the reach of cameras, tourists, and commercial exploitation, reveals a staggering miscalculation of character on the part of those drafting the proposal. To assume that 30 years of unwavering, ironclad discipline could be effortlessly swept aside by the allure of a Netflix partnership or the promise of narrative redemption demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the man holding the keys. Charles Spencer is not merely an aristocratic property owner managing a historic estate. He is a man carrying the psychological scars of a devastating historical error. Having once been tricked by fabricated documents into opening a door that led his sister straight into the catastrophic media storm of the Panorama interview, his entire subsequent life has been dedicated to ensuring that no similar manipulation ever succeeds again. Every sealed box, every locked door, and every flat refusal delivered over the decades is an architectural component of a fortress built to atone for that past vulnerability. When the courier arrived at Althorp carrying the elaborate 2027 anniversary pitch, they were not just knocking on the door of a grand English country house. They were knocking on the heavily guarded gates of a man's lifelong penance. And the quiet, definitive rejection that followed was the only logical outcome possible for a guardian who has sworn an oath written in blood and conscience. As this complex modern saga approaches its current frontier, the ramifications of Charles Spencer's unwavering refusal continue to ripple across both sides of the Atlantic, forcing every player in this grand royal drama to confront uncomfortable realities. To fully appreciate where things stand now, one must examine the precarious position in which Harry and Meghan currently find themselves as they navigate the latter half of the decade. The grand commercial architecture they envisioned upon leaving the United Kingdom, an expansive empire built on prestige partnerships, high-profile media production, and cultural influence, has faced severe headwinds that even the most optimistic Hollywood publicists can no longer ignore. From canceled Spotify contracts to struggling lifestyle brands and critically panned streaming projects, the operational runway has steadily shrunk, making the need for a major narrative breakthrough more urgent than ever. When the ambitious 2027 anniversary documentary proposal was put together, it was envisioned not merely as a look back at history, but as a strategic masterstroke designed to stabilize their shifting enterprise by anchoring it once again to the unmatched emotional gravity of Diana's story. Yet, by slamming the vault shut and denying access to the private diaries, home movies, and the sacred island grounds of Althorp, Charles Spencer effectively cut off the oxygen supply to that entire strategy. The message delivered through that profound silence was deafening. While the world may consume the public myth of Diana, her private soul remains off-limits, protected by a brother whose lifelong penance outweighs any corporate ambition or streaming contract. This historic standoff forces observers to confront a deeply sensitive and uncomfortable question that lingers at the very heart of the debate. Does anyone, even a biological son who walked behind his mother's coffin in front of 2 billion people, possess an absolute moral right to monetize and reframe a tragic legacy for commercial gain? There are two distinct, fiercely defended schools of thought on this matter, and neither can be easily dismissed without acknowledging the deep human pain that fuels it. On one side, ardent supporters of Charles Spencer's stance argue that Diana's memory has already been relentlessly commercialized, packaged, and exploited for nearly 30 years, and that turning the upcoming 30th anniversary of her passing into a promotional platform for a corporate media launch would represent a profound desecration. They contend that privacy, especially regarding personal diaries and intimate childhood footage, is a sacred boundary that must be defended against the machinery of modern entertainment, and that the keeper of the estate has a moral obligation to protect the vulnerable core of a woman who suffered so much at the hands of media intrusion during her lifetime. From this perspective, locking the gates of Althorp is not an act of hostility or petty spite, but a heroic final stand to preserve the last remaining shreds of untainted dignity belonging to a global icon. Conversely, Those who sympathize with Harry's position argue with equal emotional intensity that his claim to his mother's story is entirely different from that of a detached archivist or a corporate executive. He was a 15-year-old boy whose entire world was violently upended on a Sunday morning in Paris, forced to process unimaginable grief under the merciless glare of global flashbulbs. They argue that no historian, no estate manager, and no estranged uncle can strip away a son's visceral connection to his mother, and that his desire to tell her story through his own lens is a natural extension of his identity and his ongoing healing process. Both of these arguments carry profound emotional weight, and both reflect the tragic complexity of a family fractured beyond easy repair. Standing in William's shoes, one feels the agonizing weight of watching a deeply personal childhood trauma continuously repurposed as content for streaming algorithms, knowing full well that institutional constraints prevent a public defense. Standing in Harry's shoes, one feels the heavy burden of a man who lost everything at a tender age, only to find himself locked out of the very archives that could help him bridge the painful distance between his memories and the public myth. Yet, looking past the competing claims of grief and inheritance, the ultimate villain of this modern tragedy does not reside within the historic walls of Althorpe, nor does it sit comfortably in a sunlit mansion in Montecito or behind the gilded gates of Kensington Palace. The true antagonist of this entire narrative is the relentless, insatiable apparatus of the modern attention economy, an industry that looks at a dead woman's handwritten diaries, calculates their streaming value, wraps itself in the language of tribute, and converts raw human sorrow into quarterly corporate targets and launch windows. That is where the fundamental problem lies. Not with a son seeking connection to his mother's spirit, not with an uncle honoring a solemn vow made before God and millions of witnesses, but with a commercial system that insists on turning human pain into profitable product. As the world edges closer to the solemn milestone of 2027, the man who has remained silent for nearly 3 decades has already delivered his definitive verdict. Charles Spencer did not need to hold a press conference or write an explosive memoir to make his voice heard. His quiet, uncompromising refusal spoke louder than any grand speech ever could. The Sussex operation now finds itself at a formidable crossroads, forced to navigate its future and chart its narrative course without the foundational support of the original archives, facing a public and an industry that are increasingly demanding authentic substance over recycled proximity to royalty. How they choose to adapt, what avenues they pursue next, and whether they can forge a sustainable path forward independently remains a story still being actively written, with no obvious endings and no guaranteed audiences waiting on the other side. But one thing is now abundantly clear to everyone watching this extraordinary royal drama unfold. The ghost of Diana will continue to cast a long, powerful shadow over the modern world, not because her private life was completely laid bare for public consumption, but precisely because one man stood firm at the gates and ensured that some parts of her humanity remained forever sacred, untouched, and truly free.